In the studio is John Wilkes, who's the Scotland Director of the Equality and Human Rights Commission and a member of the Scottish Government's Hate Crime Review Advisory Group. And we're joined from London by Ella Whelan, who's Assistant Editor at the online magazine Spiked. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Ella, can I go to you first of all? What's your reaction to Mhairi Black's very powerful speech today?
There's a lot to say about it and a lot to criticise about it, I think. I didn't find it very powerful. In fact, it kind of irritated me, and I think it's going to irritate a lot of women, because what Mhairi Black has been saying is this idea that all women are faced by barrages of abuse every day, that it's getting us down to the point that we need to criminalise it, that there's this kind of epidemic of misogyny, and none of those things are true. In fact, the world of Twitter is a particularly ugly and strange place, and if you are a public figure like Mhairi Black, or even a lowly journalist like myself, if you're going to say political things, give an opinion, someone's going to come at you with some kind of ridiculous or unpleasant statement. It doesn't make it right, but it is the world that Twitter is. And the idea that there is kind of swarms of men waiting to abuse women online is also not true. In fact, there have been studies recently done by the think tank Demos showing that women are as much perpetrators of so-called misogynistic abuse as men. I'm really, really nervous about the calls to criminalise this kind of behaviour, to make misogyny a hate crime. Misogyny means something really quite serious. It's a hatred of women. It's a very strong term. It means something quite specific. It doesn't just encompass a kind of wide-ranging span of bad behaviour.
Ella, we'll go on to whether it should be a hate crime in a moment, but John, I'd like to get your reaction to it. What do you think about what Ella said, that Mhairi Black had exaggerated it, that it isn't a widespread problem, and that perhaps her position is unique?
Well, I think Mhairi's speech was quite powerful. I think she was reflecting personally the abuse she receives as an MP, and she was saying that a lot of that abuse is targeted at her and framed in a way because she's a woman. That clearly is something that's present in society. Clearly, politics is a tough business, but should we allow the level of discourse to get into the level of personal abuse? And that's the debate that really we're having around hate crime.
Yes, and Ella, Mhairi Black does say that the insults were tailored to her because she was a woman.
Well, this is the claim of several MPs. So we had Diane Abbott earlier this year claiming that she had received masses of racist and misogynistic abuse. There's this kind of idea that female MPs get a rougher time. I'm not so convinced of that. I think that actually, in relation to what Mhairi Black has had thrown at her, quite a lot of the abuse, as she has described herself, was in relation to her missing work. And I won't repeat the stuff she said because it used rude words, but some of it was in relation to her supposedly being ragged, which was not necessarily gendered. I think there's a kind of desire to jump on this and paint it as misogynistic in a way that kind of is meant to symbolise the fact that there's something deeply wrong with men and deeply wrong with society, that we have an issue with misogyny, which we just do not have.
We don't have an issue with misogyny. There were just insults, not misogynistic insults. I don't know if that makes any better.
Clearly there is misogyny in society. To what level and what degree it exists, I think that's hard to say.
Why is that clear, though? Sorry, just if it's hard to tell to what level it exists, why is that clear? This is my point. It does not exist.
John?
Well, I think a lot of the evidence that's been gathered, certainly in the review that's happening in Scotland, would say that the experiences of many organisations that represent women, or women themselves, would say there is a level of misogyny that does exist, that women do feel sometimes targeted, particularly online, and that's the issue that we're considering in the Hate Crime Review Group. Obviously, I can't speak for the review group because it's led by Lord Brackendale, but that's one of the issues about whether hate crime, because we already set standards about the fact that there is hatred that does exist towards other groups in society, which is why we've got hate crime against people of different sexual orientation or disability, or people who are trans, or from different religions or different races. So we've already said and recognised that there are, for particular groups of people in society, levels of hostility that we feel we should...
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but do you agree with what Mhairi Black says, and that she feels it's being normalised?
Well, I think the more that you have these sorts of speech in mainstream society, then it can help to normalise this sort of behaviour and language. that's obviously not a good thing. So how do we tackle that, and how do we consider dealing with that is the issue at hand.
What do you think then, John, about classing misogyny as a hate crime? You're on the advisory group. Is there a case for it?
Well, certainly in the consultation that the advisory group put out, as I say, I can't speak for the advisory group. It's going to report later this year. Certainly, some of the questions that were asked about whether people felt that the current levels or the current areas where hate crime exists against sexual orientation, race, faith, and so on, should be extended to cover other groups such as gender or age, and that's something that the group is considering.
Ella, there are some people that think it would be very beneficial if misogyny was made a hate crime.
No, I don't think it would be. The reason why I get so het up about this is not because I want to defend these kinds of terrible abusive remarks or insults, but it's the question of what this says about women. So if we're going to make misogyny a hate crime, and what we're talking about misogyny here is catcalling, sexual misconduct, rude comments, which is, not in my books misogyny, but that's what we're talking about here. What we're saying is that women need the state, the authorities, the police to manage and monitor their everyday lives. Are we really saying, as is happening in Nottingham, that we want the police to...
Ella, maybe you don't need that, but maybe there are other women out there that do.
No, this is the argument that I always get, and the reason, and this is what Mhairi Black said. She said, "Look, I'm in a position of power." She seems to think she's a model for society, which is not MPs' roles. But what about the poor, shy women out there who can't deal with this or don't have the power to deal with this? That really, I'd be very cautious about making that argument, because then what you kind of say is there's a swathe of women out there who don't have a backbone, who can't stand up for themselves, who don't have any kind of sense of their own agency. And that's really not true. You will get women who are of different personalities who can, deal with this differently. The point is, if we're making a political point of how to deal with this, it is social change happens through individuals and collectives coming together and arguing for this on the street. If a guy shouts at you on the street, you deal with it there and then. You don't go crying to the police, because that's like saying that women aren't able to handle this. And I think that is actually pretty sexist.
Well, I think if you applied those same arguments, then you'd be arguing for not having any hate crime protection for people who are
I don't
gay
think hate crime is a good way of dealing with this kind of stuff on the whole. I think extending it to women would be even worse.
Okay,
well, that's a different point, but I think we have said in society, certainly here in Scotland, that there are certain minorities who we know receive abuse, both verbal and physical, and that one way of tackling that is to call it out and recognise it for what it is, which is a crime motivated by distaste or dislike or hatred of that particular group, and we as a society saying that's wrong. Now, whether we extend those protections or those laws to issues of misogyny or age is something that one needs to consider. Certainly the Commission hasn't reached a view yet about whether hate crime should be extended to these different groups. There are certain things one has to consider. But that is an active consideration we have to take as a society. But you can't say that some women aren't experiencing these sorts of things, and how do we tackle that?
OK, Ella Whelan and John Wilkes, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.